As he was scanning around, he looked about 50 feet to his left, and he saw something he immediately recognized. For any diver who can stomach the risks, Bushman's Hole is a world-class diving spot. It's located on a privately owned game farm in South Africa. There's this little tiny basin of water that almost looks like an oversized puddle. This is the entrance to Bushman's Hole. Once you step into this little puddle and push your way through the very claustrophobia-inducing entrance, you open up into the biggest freshwater cave in the world that goes down to nearly 900 feet. For young South African Deon Dreyer, the pull to go to Bushman and explore it was irresistible. The dive was going great, but on the way up, as they were making their ascent, the diver ahead of Deon looked back at him, and Deon seemed fine. He gave the hand signal that everything was going great. He had his flashlight out. And then about 30 feet higher in the water, that same diver turned around to check on Deon, and Deon wasn't there anymore. And in fact, this guy saw his flashlight that was still attached to him basically wavering as it sunk farther and farther down Bushman's Hole. He turns around and starts swimming as fast as he can down to try to get to Deon, but Deon was sinking so quickly that this diver realized that it's a suicide mission if I try to go down there. I will either pass out or run out of air. And so deeply saddened, this group of divers had to turn around and leave Deon at the bottom of Bushman's Hole. Although the other divers didn't know for sure, they told Deon's parents that most likely he had suffered from a deep water blackout and then had drowned. 10 years later, Dave Shaw, who was a 50-year-old extremely audacious cave diver, was passing the 800-foot mark inside of Bushman's Hole, becoming the third person ever to reach this depth. As he was scanning around, he looked about 50 feet to his left, and he saw something he immediately recognized. It was a human body. They were on their back with their arms stretched out towards the surface, and when Shaw went over to them, he immediately recognized that this is Deon Dreyer. Shaw examines Deon to see if he's going to be able to be pulled to the surface, if he's solid enough to be pulled to the surface. But as soon as Shaw tried to move him, he couldn't get him to budge because his tanks were caught on something. And so Shaw stayed there for a minute trying to get him free, but he couldn't do it. So he ended up tying a line to Deon's body so he could be located again, and then Shaw began the very slow ascent back to the surface. After lots and lots of planning, Shaw's recovery of Deon was scheduled for January 8th, 2005. The dive was going to take 12 hours, and it wasn't just going to be Dave doing the retrieval. Shaw entered the water with a camera on his helmet to film the operation. Shortly after he submerged, Deon's parents walked down to the edge of the water to watch. They showed up intentionally late so as not to put added pressure on Shaw. 13 minutes after Shaw had submerged, the diver who was slotted above him began looking for signs that Shaw was done and was moving up towards him. But when he looked down, he saw Shaw's flashlight wasn't moving. This diver continued to watch the flashlight very intently to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. And after a couple of minutes and still no movement, this diver begins going deeper and deeper to try to get a better look at Shaw to see what's going on. And when he got a little bit closer, it became very clear that Shaw was not moving. This diver immediately goes into rescue mode and starts going straight down to get to Shaw to try to help him if he still can. And as he's moving down, he hears this fizzling sound and he looks at his wrist and he can tell that one of his gauges has broken. And so with a heavy heart, he had to turn around and go back up. And because of the depth at which they were diving, he could not just go right to the surface and tell everybody what had happened. He needed to stop at various decompression stops along the way. But he had a slate, and on it he wrote in his grease pen, "Dave's not coming back." And he swam the slate up to the next diver who would have received Deon's body, but instead receives this slate. As soon as this message was read out loud to the group standing around Bushman's Hole, which included Deon's parents, there was 30 seconds of stunned silence. No one could believe this was happening. And then after the silence, Deon's parents are beside themselves. Not only are they not going to see their son probably ever again, but they feel like they are somehow responsible for Shaw's death. Eventually, by the end of the night, all of the other divers that were in the water that day successfully exited the cave and were just fine. As for Shaw, much like Deon, there really wasn't a good way to get him out, and so everyone came to terms with the reality that he was going to be down there with Deon probably forever. Afterwards, they started pulling up the lines, and as they're doing that, they noticed all these bubbles coming up from the bottom of the cave. And they looked a little bit closer, and it was Shaw's body and Deon's body. Basically, Shaw had been attached to this line, and he had managed to free Deon before he had passed. And so when they pulled the line, both of them were freed and they floated to the surface. And so even though Shaw would die by doing it, he was able to get Dion out of Bushman's cave for his family. In New Mexico, there is a very deep body of water called the Blue Hole that formed after this huge sinkhole filled with water. But at the bottom of the Blue Hole, 84 feet down, there was this little tiny opening that almost looks like the drain at the bottom of your bathtub, except it's just big enough that a grown person with scuba tanks on could wriggle through it. And if they did, they'd be entering into a vast network of tunnels and caves that have never been mapped, and many of them have never been explored. Fast forward to 2016, and an elite diving organization called the ADM Exploration Foundation that literally goes around the world exploring unmapped caves and professionally maps them. They reached out to the owners of the Blue Hole Cave and said, hey, we'd be happy to map out your forbidden section. And the owners granted them permission. So this would be the first time in 40 years that anyone had been in the deepest section of the Blue Hole. One of the divers that was going to be on this excursion was a guy named Shane Thompson. He had been a diving instructor for the United States Navy before becoming an advanced scuba instructor in San Diego. Shane had actually been told to stay on land as a safety standby diver, while another diver named Mike Young was going to be the first into the cave and would just explore the upper section. But as soon as Mike Young got in the water that morning, a couple minutes later, Shane was in the water after him. And so Shane and Mike continued down to the entrance. Shane would be the first one to wriggle his way through this very claustrophobia-inducing entrance. Once he was through, Mike followed after him. And at this point, it's pitch black. So they both got their high-powered flashlights out. And immediately, as they're kicking it out down the tunnel, they realize there's a lot of silt. And so their lights aren't really that good. It would be like driving in really intense fog and turning on your high beams. That's not going to do anything. You're just going to illuminate the fog around you. So they just slowly made their way forward before Shane identified a tunnel that kind of branched off to the right. And they can see there is an opening at the end of this tunnel, maybe 20, 30 feet down, that appears to open up into a much larger cavern. Shane takes off first, Mike follows him, and as they're getting closer and closer to what they think is going to be this huge cavern, they actually suddenly get stuck. Shane gets stuck first, Mike comes up alongside him because it's so silty he can't see. Mike stays calm and begins to push himself backwards to just retreat out of the situation he is in. While Shane, in a total panic, instead of coming backwards towards Mike, begins going forward through this tiny little narrow opening and somehow manages to force himself into this chamber. Mike has retreated back out to the main hallway and he's just waiting for Shane to do the same thing. But when he never shows up, Mike goes back down the tunnel. He goes right up to the little entrance into this cavern and he pokes his head in and he scans the light around and he doesn't see Shane anywhere, but he sees right away that there's all these different exits into different tunnels that shoot all over this cavern. And so he takes a deep breath and he begins forcing himself through this tiny little hole. But once he was through, he pointed his light up and he looked for the biggest opening to one of those tunnels and he began swimming up after Shane. He manages to get to the end and it's a dead end, and curled up at the very back of the dead end was Shane. His mouthpiece was out and he was deceased. After Shane's body was recovered, they resealed the forbidden section, and to this day, no one is allowed to go in again.